thanks to everyone for coming. It's lovely to see such a nice crowd here. We're here to meet and hear from a rather extraordinary woman, Zarghuna Kargar, who has brought out this great book, which I've finished reading today and would really recommend all of you purchase. First copy is available here. It's a wonderful collection of stories, really, from a programme, the Afghan equivalent of Woman's Hour, which Zarghuna was presenting for several years. And she does a wonderful job in the book of really bringing to life some really extraordinary stories of a whole range of different women, which she does with a typical kind of Afghan poetry and lots of empathy and compassion. It's a really good read. To be honest, some of the stories are quite harrowing. Having worked myself in Afghanistan, I was originally in Afghanistan for the BBC and then for the last several years for Human Rights Watch. One is faced often with some really harrowing stories, some dismal human rights abuses, miserable stories of women suffering often in silence in their families. But the thing that makes it such a kind of, it's made me very passionate about it and keeps you working on the issues is the extraordinary strength and dignity and courage of the women that you're meeting. And indeed the women like Zarghuna, who are journalists and human rights defenders, who are trying to change the way in which things are happening in Afghanistan. So we'll hear a little bit about some of the stories. In fact, I might just kick off straight away with asking you which story was the story that perhaps moved you most in your years of working on here, or perhaps pulling it together for the book.
I can say all the stories that I have collected in this book moved me in a very personal way. It touched my feeling as a woman, and it touched my feelings as an Afghan woman. That's why I chose these particular stories and collected them in this book. Stories of women like Shirin Jan, who is given away to settle the family dispute, or a story of Elaha, who was not accepted by her in-laws because she was considered as not a good woman because she didn't bleed on her wedding night, and she wasn't considered a virgin. Or women like Jan Parry, who is suffered like many other women in Afghanistan from poverty. Being a widow, looking after kids, and trying very hard to find a piece of bread for her young kids on her own. All these stories, I think it would touch any woman's feeling, or any mother's, or any sister's, any grandmother's feeling, and they are very special to me.
Tell us a bit about Shirin Jan, because that is a very poignant story, and it's a tradition called Bard, where women are given effectively as compensation to settle a dispute. If, for instance, somebody's been raped, then they might find that the family of the rapist might have to give a daughter as compensation to the victim's family. It's a really extraordinary.
Shirin Jan's case is particular in a way that there are a lot of disputes happening among certain families in Afghanistan over the land, over water distribution, and as a result, sometimes men of the family end up killing each other. And if they don't end that dispute, then it will carry on from generation to generation, and there are examples of that in Afghanistan. Shirin Jan is one of those examples of those girls who has been given away to settle the dispute of her father with another family, who ended up killing a guy from their family. And in a way, this tradition is a very long tradition of Afghanistan. And in a way, it solves the problem in the sense that it stops dispute, or it stops losing blood in a way. But on the other hand, a woman like Shirin Jan suffers. She was young, she was 9 or 10 years old when she was given away by her father to this family. And the way that the other family treated her was, she was a mean of revenge for the other family. And this has been happening. It touched me, and I decided to write about her because now she is maybe there or not. I couldn't contact her again. She was 70 years old when I interviewed her. It was a long time from the tradition that's gone. Me as an Afghan here, I believe that this might be a very old tradition of my culture, and it might have ended now. In 21st century, maybe an Afghan girl is not given away no more, but it wasn't true. I found out in my own relatives that the girl was given, like Parna, another young girl, in 2006 to settle a family dispute, and these things are happening.
Well, even today, we've looked into cases for Human Rights Watch happening in the last, several years. It's not something that's going away very quickly. Yeah. But do you get the sense that since the fall of the Taliban, with the new government, women in parliament, many more women active in public life, programs like yours, that these sorts of traditions are dying out?
Actually, during the Taliban, it was banned. Yeah. It was banned, and the Taliban really were strict with these kind of traditions because it's not Islamic, or it's not according to Sharia to give away a girl in settling a dispute, because first of all, she hasn't done it. Secondly, why another human being becoming a mean of revenge? But recently these kind of cases are coming out, and a program like Afghan Woman was a platform for these kind of women to speak about what they went through, or to tell us the stories, or to share their feelings and their lives with many listeners throughout Afghanistan. And in the last years, the good thing is that women can come and speak about it, or at least the incidents get reported. There was a dead period that women didn't know where to go or who to report to. They couldn't go to school, they couldn't get education. So in that sense, it's a positive thing that it's coming out to media, or people talk about it, or they can talk about it.
Although tragically, Women's Hour is no longer broadcasting because sadly the money's been cut by the Foreign Office, who pays for the BBC World Service. So there isn't this outlet now, which is a great shame since 2010, I think. The programme has finished. And one of the incredibly important things, as you say, is that this was one of the few places where some very controversial and sensitive issues could be raised. There were a couple of stories that struck me as very taboo issues to be talking about on the radio, including homosexuality and as you mentioned, Ilaha's story about virginity. When you broadcast those kinds of stories, did you have complaints? Did it make people angry? Did any of the staff come under pressure for talking about those kinds of taboos? These topics that we discussed on the Afghan Women's Hour were somehow topics that maybe it was discussed for the first time on the BBC, and women had the chance for the first time to come to the BBC and talk to us and share their stories. And obviously every topic that you discuss has a effect of positive on some listeners or negative. But surprisingly, I got so many positive feedback from people who heard the program. They were about Ilaha,
and especially doctors. I was in Afghanistan when it was playing out, and I remember a doctor called the BBC office and wanted to talk to me, and he said that this is a topic and these informations are very limited in Afghanistan, because there's no such thing as sexual education, sex education in Afghanistan, in schools or in universities, and these are topics that are not discussed, or they are considered shame to be talked about. And he was so happy that the BBC brought it to the attention of listeners, and examples like Ilaha, and it brought more women to talk to me. They give courage to more women. And after that, another lady contacted me personally in the BBC office in Kabul, and she told me her story. And overall, it empowered me as an Afghan woman living in London. I managed to make decisions which were against somehow to my tradition or to my family standards or family norms, and these women empowered me. They give me courage. They give me hope for the best.
Because I mean, you yourself are a character in the book as well. Really, you're sometimes painfully honest about some of the things that you've gone through in your own life, and the stories that have, had too much familiarity to events that you've suffered. Was it difficult to have that much honesty yourself as an Afghan woman whose name is well known in the country, to engage in that level of honesty is quite brave?
It's very difficult. I'm scared about the people who will read it, but in a way, when I was writing it, it was helping me in my own psychology. It's always good, I think, when you're hurt in life or when you go through difficult moments. I found it a very rewarding thing to write about it. For me, the most important thing is the honesty about my own life and about these women who came with so much trust and told me their stories, and they made me able to be open about what I went through as an Afghan woman, because I found that the feeling of women were the same, whether Ilaha was in Shibirgan or whether Gulalai was in Kabul or I was in London. We were going through same things as Afghan women, as women of that culture, women of that tradition, and they were empowering, and I hope that people who read it will respect what we have written and what we have said or what we disclose about our lives, and I hope that it will be a learning point to other girls and to other mothers or to other sisters or men especially. For me it is difficult every time I think about it, because I'm a bit scared of what will be the reaction of people who will read it, but in a way, even though it's public, I have published it. I hope that one reader is reading it, they say one time, and they take it in a positive way. I respect the feelings which are there.
One of the stories that I was very struck by, because it was quite an unfamiliar, unusual story to me, was the story of Bock. Tell us a little bit about her story. Bock was brought up as a boy because her family had no sons. So from a very young age, she was dressed as a man, and the description captures very much that awful position she's then in later in life, when she's neither really respected as a man or a woman. This convention seems to be accepted, that some families resort to this, but at the same time she's always going to be an outsider, I felt.
There are examples like Bock. I just wanted to mention that none of these names in the book are their true names. So Bock is a woman from Khost province, and we interviewed her. She's wearing male clothes and like the turban for men, and she is living like a man. And her appearance was changed when she was young, because she had only one brother who used to go to Arab Emirates for work, and they didn't have any other man to look after the women in the family. Because she was the eldest daughter, they decided that she will be the man of the family, even though for an Afghan woman or for a woman from that area, when they give you this responsibility of looking after the family and having the freedom of going out or talking to men and having that freedom that normal, an ordinary other woman won't have it's a privilege from the family side, and it's a big thing. Many women will not get that treatment, and Bock got it. But what we found by speaking to her was about her feelings as a woman. When we asked Bock that how does she feel, she said, I enjoy the freedom, I enjoy that I go and sit with men and decide about the matters of lands or village, but on the other hand, I'm a woman, I want to be a mother, I want to be married, I want to be loved. and I want to have a family, which I can't. And no one understood my feeling as a woman, that I want to be beautiful. I want to stand in front of mirror having long hair, open hair, rather than having the male turban. Her message was to other Afghan mothers that never change the appearance of your daughter to a man. No matter how they live or how much freedom they have, when it comes to the feelings, no one can change that feeling, because God has given them that body or those feelings or those emotions that mine is of a woman, but I cannot express it. And she was subject to people making fun of her because she was a woman. Her voice was like a woman. Her body was of a woman's body, but she was acting like a man. And she said, like, I wish I could wash the cups like a woman, or I wish I could cook like a woman, or like my sister-in-law, rather than being a man who works on the land.
But do you think some of the people listening, some of the women listening who do nothing but cook and wash and act as servants may have been a bit jealous of her relative freedom?
They do a lot of other things as well. They write books.
Well, you write books, yes.
Yeah, she just was giving examples of what she would have felt comfortable with. She was just giving example of her sister-in-law who had kids, and she was looking after them because her brother was in other country. She said, I wish I was doing these simple things rather than having big responsibilities of a man, of a family of women.
Tell us, one of the things that I find difficult in my own work in Afghanistan, trying to do advocacy around some of these kinds of issues, is that it's quite easy to fall into a pattern of looking at these kinds of abuses and trying to shame people and say, this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. Particularly as a foreigner, you can, sound terribly imperious and judgmental. And actually, I remember being really struck visiting a family where a girl had run away. She'd been in a forced marriage as a child, and she'd run away. She was terribly brave, but the family were appalled and wanted her back, and she was afraid that they would kill her. They'd issued some death threats to various people that were protecting her. And I went to visit this family, and they were charming. They gave me lots of food and were really kind to me, and were explaining the degree to which they felt like their lives had ended because she'd run away from home. They felt they couldn't walk down the street anymore because they'd been so shamed. They'd lost their work. They felt that this was the end of their life, so they would do anything they could to bring her back, even though that probably meant killing her. But I found that the way that you were treating these stories, you also have the family whole as well, and some empathy for the different people in the family rather than just the miserable situation of the victims here. But that's one of the things that makes it difficult to shift attitudes, because some of the people who are, from one perspective, perpetrating terrible crimes against these girls, like giving them away as compensation for a crime, think that they're doing the right thing in their own sort of moral framework often. How do you feel that you can go about changing those kinds of attitudes when people are doing the right thing in their view?
I think from what I have discovered from working with the Afghan Women's Hour and with the women, one of the main thing was a lack of information and a lack of rights. Lack of your Islamic rights as a Muslim woman in the country. Some people have very little information, limited information, that they think that giving away to settle a dispute, giving away to a girl to settle a dispute is a way that Muslims do. They don't. It's not. And this kind of information are limited to people and to families, and traditions which have been made by men and for men have continued being followed in the families, and the experts and the response we got from the interviews with experts and human rights organizations or psychologists and all the experts we invited, or the women were themselves experts who went through these things. So many listeners got back to us and said, like, oh, we learned that this is not the way that it should be done. So many of them told us, like, we thought it's Islamic. So many of those women and girls and it's just lack of information. I think providing more information, providing more access to these kind of information, and talking to women can change attitude, or talking to families. For example, at the end of the program, when it was closing in 2010, our colleagues in Afghanistan went and spoke to different women about, and they asked them if the program had achieved or had made a difference to life. One woman from Wardak province said that when she and her family heard the story of Shirinjan, and then the experts who explained the situation, and there are other ways, alternative ways of settling disputes, or giving animals, or giving money, or giving land, a piece of land to settle the dispute. She said, we saved the girl's life in Wardak province, because the women went and said, hang on, the women will suffer because they will use her as a mean of revenge, but let's solve it the other way, and men listen to them. Because in many families, in many Afghan families, women are the leading people, the leading personalities of the families. They work on lands, they help their husbands, they bring earning, and I hope there is change. I hope change will come. And in every society, I believe, even in here, I think in 50 years ago or many years ago, women had to sacrifice to get the freedom they have. Women had to go through difficulties to get what they have today, the achievements. So
sadly, what you're describing is that you need something like a radio program in Dari and Pashtu that talks about women's stories, which we used to have. I wanted to ask you, I'm going to open it up to the floor in a minute, but I wanted to ask you a rather more political question. On many people's minds at the moment is the prospect of reconciliation with the Taliban. And we have women in many parts of the country paying a terribly heavy price in the conflict. But at the same time, many women with really heavy hearts about the prospect of the return of the Taliban in some political form to the country. What are your fears? What do you see happening?
From what I have, war damages a lot of things, and as you said, women have lost so much. Mothers have lost their sons in the war, and they have lost their husbands. They have been subject to rape because of the war. They have been subject to being homeless. They have lost their houses. So they have had big losses, women of Afghanistan. And for those women, peace is what it matters. When they don't hear bullet noises or rockets or suicide attack or their sons being brainwashed for attacks against each other, that's the most important thing, peace. And for some women that I've spoken, like who are, for example, women parliamentarian I've spoken recently to, or women's minister, that was my question, like, well, how do you feel about the peace talks with the Taliban? They said, we want peace, but not in the price of losing what we have achieved in the last 10 years. Women have had many achievements in Afghanistan since the fall of the Taliban. We have women parliamentarians now, we have doctors working in hospitals, we have nurses, we have midwives, we have teachers, we have girls going to school, and they don't want to lose this. And they are asking, like, talk to Taliban, bring peace, but not with the price of our losing our achievements. And we want to achieve more, we want to go ahead, because they are an important part of the society, and democracy doesn't work without women, I think.
No, but I'm not sure that Mullah Omar would agree with you. But, I mean, seriously though, I mean, if we do get to a stage where some kind of political representative group of the Taliban is brought back into political life, I would imagine that women in parliament might be one of the first things to go. Do you think? Do you think that the Karzai government and some of the opposition politicians would stand for that?
I think peace talks, if the international community is involved in, and if they are backing it, or if Britain is backing the peace talks, this is a very obvious thing that it should be. Women's rights, women's issues should be a part of every strategy. Afghanistan cannot go back to what it was 10 years ago. Girls need education. It's in the constitution, and people who don't accept it, in my opinion, as an Afghan woman, they shouldn't be allowed in any process. Yeah, women are part of their families. Their mothers are women. They were born by a woman. Women have given birth to them. How can they stop women from all this? And every strategy that's laid, or every plan which is made for a country or by anyone, women should be involved in it, and women have similar rights. I think humans have similar rights. That's it.
I'm not going to disagree with you on that one. Let's open it up to the audience. There's a question immediately from the gentleman just there. If you could just give us your name, if you're,
Alan Bhatti, Zarghuna, it's very refreshing to hear your views, and thank you very much for coming and speaking to us. I'd like to pick up, first of all, on that very last question about the Taliban and Mullah Omar and exactly what his views would be. I think there's a huge misconception in the West as to what his views might be, and I don't agree that he would actually have the views that you think he has. I mean, I personally have never met him, but my uncle has met him, and I know a little bit about what goes on in Afghanistan. If you started at the beginning by saying that, in fact, some of the oppression of women in terms of the sale, essentially, of girls and so on, that was something that the Taliban did clamp down on, and that's not the only anti-women thing that the Taliban clamped down on. They did also try to stop the trafficking in women that was going on, that was filling the brothels of Lahore and Islamabad. They also clamped down on the dancing boys and the trafficking in boys as well. So there are things that, in fact, the Taliban did that wasn't that bad. One of the fears that I have is that this Western attitude towards the Taliban is leading to a process of strengthening the tribal traditions as a way of undermining the Taliban. And by strengthening the tribal traditions, it's going to be a lot more difficult to break away from these patterns that you've been describing. So that's one of the points that I'd like to make. But also, I do wonder whether we need to think more carefully about who are the Taliban, which Taliban we're talking about. And I think the Mullah Omar Taliban are very different from the people we generally call Taliban in Afghanistan. And thirdly, and finally, the question of your program, which I've never heard, I'm afraid, but I'm sure it's very good. I hope it's not like Women's Hour. But talking to the women is one thing. Surely we need to talk to the men in Afghanistan. So what is being done to actually talk to them and persuade the men that they need to change their attitude?
During our work in the Afghan Women's Hour, many men participated in our program, and many of the men were the experts of the issues. And many husbands came, many brothers came, many grandfathers came, and many fathers came in our program, and they were actually the people who were talking about of their information. Obviously, every society has good and bad, and there were. I remember we were speaking. I had a discussion with a father and an expert of human rights about dowry. We call it dowry, and he was a father of 6 girls who didn't take any money with any marriage of any of his daughters, and he was an Afghan father. And also one important bit in this program, because women were keen to hear from men. That has been a little bit the norm of the society, that men are the decision-making bodies, and women wait for the man to make the decision, whether it's about the marriage of the daughter, whether it's about the marriage of, whether it's about buying a carpet for the house. Every little thing is shared decision with a man, and they were very keen to hear from men. One of the women, I remember, she had twin babies, a boy and a girl. There's a huge difference between treatments for a boy and a girl in some Afghan families. They obviously value boys more, and this mother was feeding her son, the boy, more than the girl, and the girl ended up in hospital because she was malnutrited. Her story is in the book, and she was the one who said, I would like to hear from a man to tell me that, yeah, my girl and my daughter, or my son and my daughter are the same, and I can feed them both. Because me and my husband believe that my son will be looking after us, and my daughter will marry, and she will be looking after another family. So she was very keen to hear it from a man, and we brought male doctors who explained the situation, that how important it is to feed both babies. Yeah, yeah. Similar, how important it is to feed babies, simple.
Can I pick up on the point about the Taliban?
Sorry, before you do that, can I just say something about that last comment? And that's all very well, but you're still talking about your program, which I assume is listened to largely by women. It's not listened to by men.
Maybe I'm wrong. Listened more by men.
Okay. As was Women's Hour here, actually. But if I could just come back on the point about the Taliban. I mean, I agree that we do tend to demonise the Taliban in the West and see them as a monolith. But I really do think, I brought out a report, excuse me, which I would encourage you to look at. It's on the Human Rights Watch website, about reconciliation and the Taliban, which is partly informed by some discussions with former Talibs and people who are involved with the movement. And this question about things like women in political life is going to be a really serious one, not necessarily because they don't approve of women as politicians, but because of issues about men and women mixing in the same place, about women travelling without a mahram, without an escort. And it's going to be quite difficult to reconcile that with women in Parliament, and it's also quite likely that the Constitution will be opened up, which is the great safeguard of a lot of women's rights, including the right to have women in Parliament and to participate in public life and to an education. So, I mean, I think you're right to say let's not demonise the Taliban, and let's also keep in mind that many of the opposition politicians in Parliament and the Karzai government itself have views pretty similar to the Taliban, but the Taliban cannot be whitewashed. I mean, they do present very significant threats to women's rights, and the areas where the Taliban have control in Afghanistan currently. You get night letters, death threats, girls' schools being closed down, threat letters to women in public life saying, you know, you're a whore for working, you know. So let's keep a balanced perspective of what reconciliation will mean. I think it's very hard to see it not having an impact on human rights, to be honest. But I'm not suggesting that shouldn't then be the alternative.
Well, I mean, that's a debate that can go on and on. I just want to make a quick comment about Bakhtahar, which you mentioned.
Can we move on to some other questions?
I just want to say that it's very similar to what happens in the Balkans, in some aspects of the Balkans. You can see very similar things in the Balkans as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's have some more questions.
Zarghuna, I was wondering, is your book going to be published in Pashto and Dari?
I'm hoping that I will translate it into Pashto and Dari myself, and I really do hope that I will do it soon, and that is one of my plans. Maybe one of my sisters do it. Yeah. But that is, I would love to translate it in my own languages, because my mom doesn't read English, and I would like my mom to read about my stories. Up to now, she just knows that I've told her that this is this story, and because a lot of information about the cultural and the tradition aspect of it comes from my mom, because she has been my source of information about what happened, and examples like Tewara in her village, in her lifetime. And I would like her to read about her own information that she's given me, definitely.
And is she excited about the book coming out, or is she anxious?
No, she's very excited. Good. Yeah, it's very good. Yeah.
Another question. Okay.
My name's Sandra Kaduri. I was a communications advisor working in Afghanistan for a while. Just two big questions, really. One is the international community doing enough to help women's rights? And often you feel they're not that outspoken sometimes on these issues, which are left as very sensitive issues. And I just wondered what you thought on that, and also if the Afghan government is doing enough on women's rights.
No, you go.
Okay, I as an Afghan woman feel like international community should do more. They should bring women program back. They should give more money. but there has a lot of work has been done, and we see it. Just example of women parliamentarians and education for women, all these women organizations that work in Afghanistan, and there are NGOs who work for widows of war. There are NGOs who train women with media, and there's a lot of work being done at the moment for women and girls in Afghanistan. But for a country who has suffered 30 years or more than that of war and suppression and a lot of difficulties that people have lost, they've been starting from zero and scratch so many times. So there's more help needed, and I think there's more attention needed by government and by international community, I think.
Question now here.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background? Because your English is flawless. Did you go to high school, university in the UK? Are your parents based here? Was Women's Hour produced here in London at the BBC?
I was born in Kabul, and I was around 10, 11 years old when I left Afghanistan with my family to Pakistan. We became refugees of war when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Mujahideen came, and during the end of 1994 I left Afghanistan. I started going to a refugee school which was funded by Saudi Arabia in Peshawar for Afghan refugees. I went there and I learned English as a language in a separate course, private. There were so many private courses for Afghan refugees. We had to pay, and they were actually very good courses. And I learned English there, and there I started working for the BBC because I went to a journalism course. I didn't go to a proper university. I started a journal because I always loved to be speaking to the mic or singing to the mic, and I went to journalism course, and the BBC World Service Trust had a week workshop for young people who were keen to make radio programs, and at that time the BBC was doing a lot of work with young people in Peshawar. I was one of their students, and they selected me as a freelance reporter. I wasn't a journalist then, but I believed I was because and I was reporting on small topics of women in refugee camps. And then in 2001 I came to UK as an asylum seeker with my family because the Taliban were in power in Afghanistan and we couldn't go back. We lost everything there. We lost our house, my dad lost his job, and we didn't have a chance to go back to the country. We decided to come to UK, and I started working for the BBC World Service Trust on a lifeline project for refugees, because that time the 2001 11 September happened, and Afghans were on the top of the news every time, and I was lucky to be speaking Dari and Pashto, and the BBC needed women. I joined them as on freelance basis and carried on working. I actually didn't go to a university but I did attended an English course here, which was private course. And I learned English with my friends and colleagues. And thank you.
BBC, lucky to find you. Who's next for the question? Over in the corner here.
My name is Untitled Chapter. I'm from the BBC. First of all, congratulations, Zarghuna.
Thank you.
Secondly, I would like to clarify one thing. When there is talk of Taliban, and the constitution is clear, we spoke with the Afghan government officials that anything happens that would be inside or according to the constitution. So it is good just to encourage the peace process, because if you speak with the people who are suffering in Helmand, in Kandahar, I have been in Nangarhar in the eastern part of Afghanistan. So we have the responsibility to raise their voice as well. There are also people who have the right to live a peaceful life. Secondly, my question is from Zarghuna, as we have tradition with similar tradition both sides of the border. Pashtuns are living as well, a great number of them in Pakistan. Is there any story of this side of the border in your book?
Yes, there is a story of this side of the border, the Pashtuns.
In Pakistan.
Yeah, in Pakistan, because in Peshawar, as I said, I went to many refugee camps and I met a lot of women and girls there when I was working with the BBC World Service Trust on the Children Project, and I met these amazing women in the border areas, and one of them is in the book. She's a nomad girl. And I think I found her really powerful, and her stories is amazing. Hopefully you will read about it. It's always difficult to answer one of the people you know. And I know this guy very well. Yeah, there are stories of girls, and there are stories of my class fellows during the journalism course I did. So all the stories are not from Afghan Women's our program. There are stories that I have met in my lifetime. I've met the girls and I've met the women during those years when I lived in Peshawar, and I've written about them.
I'm tempted to come back, but I don't want to kind of take over by talking about the reconciliation thing too much. I hope you're right, Sarah, is all I will say. I hope the Constitution does remain and does keep protecting people's rights, but I fear it may be opened up at some point, in which case we shall see. So I have a question at the front here. The gentleman in the green there.
Can you tell us something of what religion plays as a part in society, from the extreme bigot that we all hear about to the Muslim who's happy to have a glass of wine on the quiet with his meal, and the way that the mullahs interact with society, and maybe whether they help you to try and discourage the less attractive tribal customs?
That's a very difficult question.
What part does Islam, on its whole spectrum, take in your life in Afghanistan?
There's a very small group of non-Muslims living in Afghanistan. So, like the majority of people, almost I don't know how much the percentage is, but most people in Afghanistan are followers of Islam, and I can only say that religious information and Islamic information is very limited to people in Afghanistan, and somehow the mosques and the religious leader play very good role. For example, today only we had today was the week of, they announced the week of vaccination polio across Afghanistan, and the mullahs of the mosques play a very leading role in awareing people of the process going around the country, and there are Afghans who follow Islam very strictly, and there are it's just like religious questions are not really my thing. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know how to answer it. Yeah. Sorry.
My name is Shireen Khan, and I'm partly Pakistani. I'm very interested in how women are portrayed always as being dominated, and clearly that's very true. But what do you think women in the West could learn from the women of Afghanistan, Pakistan, but we'll talk about Afghanistan? What are the good points of the culture for women there? What could we take on, given that the sexualization of girls here is starting at 5 or 6? I just throw that at you to see what, because there are good things.
I believe as a woman, the courage and the resilience that Afghan women have had, and that's a big learning point for me, as I said, and it can be a big learning point for girls and women in the West. The hope they have, the things they go through, but still there is so much resilience in them for having a better future or having a better tomorrow. Being, and I think there's a big learning in being thankful to what you have. And for me, there is big learning in this case, because you see women losing almost everything, and as human beings, and there's learning for men and women in appreciation, I think, of what we have in living, or just like appreciating of clean water. That's a big appreciation for me as a human being. And when I have seen life in Afghanistan, the difficulties that these women have been facing, for me, I have found respect for human being more. That's a big learning for me, and also appreciation of what we have, what God has given us. I think in that sense there's a big learning for every human being when we listen to these stories.
And it's easy when we focus in my work in Zarghuna's book to focus on some of the crises in families and some of the horrors that women and girls face. But you do also get in the book, and I'm sure in your journalistic work, a lot of the many more positive stories where the family is an incredibly powerful and strengthening force behind individuals, and also where the women themselves are taking hold of their situation. There's a lovely story towards the end of the book about a woman who discovers that one of her children's great hobbies is actually
kite-making.
Kite-making is actually going to be the thing that restores her when she becomes a widow, and sets out to create her own business, which is a very positive story about creativity and courage
and learning and doing something about your life. And Margot's story, she's a widow who has 3 kids, and when she lost her husband, she feared that she might be like many other Afghan women who will be forced to beg on the street. And if anyone has been to Afghanistan, it's not so difficult to find these women on the streets and these girls on the street who beg. And Margot decided to do something, to use her skills, or the little skills that was not even in her mind important, in her own mind. She started making kites with her kids in the house, and they're selling it in the season of kites, and she's able to buy books and notebooks and pens for her kids. She's providing education for them, education means for them, and also she's taken the lead of her life. People lose things, and humans lose close ones, but it doesn't mean that it's end of life for those who are still living. And she's an example, a powerful example of that.
Another question here,
You've obviously been involved in some quite groundbreaking work with the BBC, and also your book addresses some quite controversial issues. I just wonder whether you thought that would affect your ability to return to Afghanistan. I presume you have family there, if not immediate, then extended. And if you can't return to Afghanistan, what you intend to do next?
Actually, I have been to Afghanistan with my work so many times, and last time I went there, I lived there for nearly 4 months. For anyone, it's not for me as an Afghan woman going from here, when my family is here, or for my other colleagues or for my family, it is not easy to go to a country or to a city where suicide bombers are blowing themselves up anytime that you don't even think about. It's security is a big issue, but as an Afghan woman, I don't see any difficulties in that sense, like someone would threat to kill me, or I don't know, in that sense. But for any journalist who is working for the BBC, it's difficult, it's not easy. You have to be very careful. We have lost colleagues who were reporting for the Afghan section. Just a couple of years ago, our colleague in Helmand got killed. He was reporting for the Afghan section, BBC World Service and BBC News, and he got killed because of his work. So it's a country which is not safe for any journalist. For me as a woman, in that sense, it's not safe. But on a private basis, I think I can go and just go to my grandparents' home, sit there.
We've got a question at the front here.
I just wanted to ask you, what happens with this girl who grows up as a man in regards to relationships? Does she, or he, no, it's actually a she, sorry, go out with females then? Or what happens because then there's a whole issue of homosexuality, which is taboo, obviously. So this young girl is totally stigmatized. What happens?
She's in more
when
more,
she turns 25 years old, or her hormones are really alive.
Maybe you read Dear Zari.
It is of course. Of it, that's how
it's
difficult for me
the
to
focus,
get around my head.
The focus in her story is more about the gender aspect or the feeling of her as a woman. Just the feeling that she wants to be a mother, she wants to have a family like her sister-in-law, and she wanted to be a girl who is wearing mascara or henna on her hands, but she's not doing any of those things.
But I think the answer is she doesn't.
Happen later in life.
She doesn't get a relationship, really, does she?
No, she's single. She's single, and she will be treated as a man in the society, and she is treated as a man in her family and in the society.
But it's quite unusual stories like that.
Yes,
isn't it?
it's very unusual, and there are rare cases of stories like Tewara, which I have mentioned in the book, of the cases that I know or I have researched and found out.
How old is she now?
She's about 38, 40.
She's still acting as a man.
Yeah. She wears clothes like a man, and
there must be some is there any underground relation? Does she not have a relationship with anyone, whether it be man
underground? That's another story I have to find.
There's a lot under there.
Yeah, there's of course, but her feelings suggest that she is.
It's human nature.
Yeah, of course.
To have a relationship or some closeness with.
Yeah, the sad thing about her story is that no one realized her nature. No one or people around her didn't realize that her nature will be completely different. Her inner feelings will be.
Or at least they've decided that she must make this sacrifice for the family.
Yeah, it's a big sacrifice. Yeah.
I have a question from Emrys at the back.
Thank you, Zarghuna. I mean, it's really refreshing to hear stories of real people coming out of Afghanistan, not just the usual news reports of bombs and death and so on. I'm just struck by your stories and thinking about yourself as a young Afghan person. And Afghanistan's got nearly 50% of its population is under 18. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what your experiences have been of people calling in. Have most of them been elder or younger? And have the younger generation got different perspectives and thoughts, different questions that they want to discuss?
It was actually very mixed, mostly from adults. And I remember one day a 9-year-old girl stole her dad's mobile, and she called me. She said, "Call me back, I want to tell you my story." And because we had a slot on the program where girls used to sing with tumbles, their Afghan traditional or their village songs, and she wanted to sing a song for us, and she did. And we had many of the young girls singing on the program, because apart from the sad stories or apart from the taboo topics that we discussed on the program, we had the celebrations of those talents that Afghan women and girls have, and but in a way that the contact from the people were more from adults and more from men, because some men wrote on behalf of their grandmothers, and some men wrote on behalf of their wives to us. Because they were the educated one in the family. So it was very mixed contact, and mostly people who had means of contact, who could write or who had telephones to make phone calls, and also we would ring them back, because it's very expensive to call London numbers or Kabul numbers. It's very expensive. We would ring them back. That's what we could do at the BBC.
I remember being in Khost province once, which is in the southeast, and visiting a small radio station, and the radio manager told me that they got loads and loads of poems from anonymous poems from women and girls being sent to the station, which I was really moved by. And sadly the radio station got burnt down. I was going to go and collect them and try and get them translated, but did you get lots of poetry sent
lots,
to you?
and they are such poets, Afghan women, and they had like beautiful short verses. We call it landai, and they are the people who have created these kind of poems in the Afghan culture, and it has a big long history that people who women whose husbands or sons went to the war, they wrote about them, and they wrote about the situation. They used to sing those short poems to us on the program about the loss of their beloved ones and about the situation they were in, about their poverties. They are such great storytellers, and I think that was the main reason which I fell in love with them, for being so great and being so open and being so trusting with us in the Afghan Women's Hour, and they came with such huge trust and told us their stories and poems, and they are very creative women, I think, whether they were educated or non-educated, because we involved everyone from every age, and educated, non-educated, city women, village women, and they were so keen to be heard on radio.
I always thought it would make a nice follow-up book, actually, should you want to gather some poetry from these radio stations one day. Another question at the back there.
Janet McLeod-Trotter. I went through Afghanistan in the 70s on the overland route, a very different country then. Would you say that women were better off under the Soviet regime than they have been in the succeeding 30 years?
When it comes to war, I remember during the Soviet Union, when I was living as a child, I still saw people losing lives, and I still saw rocket attacks, and I still saw war. I'm sure, on the other hand, the other group, which was against the Soviet Union, the Mujahideen, they had big losses in their villages. Their villages were bombarded. And the women life, for me, I can only talk about my own experience, because I think as a child I had the great school, I had great teachers. Security was always the problem when I was growing up. But that time we had a lot of successes in women's life, because I could see there was no, in my mind, or maybe I was a child, I didn't understand it. In my mind, the question of watching a woman on TV and singing and having concerts, and these were normal things for me growing up as an Afghan girl that time. And then it became more strict with the Mujahideen entered Afghanistan. But I'm sure war was the same for every group, everyone, and security has been the biggest problem for people of Afghanistan. For me, I will never forget the memories of my school time. I had Russian teachers, and it was one of the most liberal schools in Kabul. It was great. We had
speak any Russian?
I did a little. I've forgotten, but I speak хорошо. Only one word or two, but I forgot all the words that I remembered. But I was going to a Russian-built school. Our teachers were Russians, and I had a privileged life, which I will never forget. I think that was maybe the most, or the best time of our lives as young kids. But I didn't understand what people in the other parts of my country were going through, which I can understand now as an adult.
A question from the lady there.
Hello, my name is Sophie Thomas. I was working in Afghanistan off and on for the last 4 or 5 years. I think one of the hardest things for people say, in the UK and other countries in the West or Europe is to understand that actually outside the family there isn't really any sanctuary for women, and that you wouldn't go, for example, to a friend's house for help, or you wouldn't go, there was no real safe place outside the family, and that the family can be a great source of strength, and it can be a great problem, but there is nothing else outside it for women. Given that there is now attempts to start to regulate the few safe houses that are there for domestic violence, do you see that this idea of sanctuary outside the family is actually going to change? A lot of the people you called in obviously were encouraged by each other's stories, but that encouragement seems to have been within the family, not outside the family space.
Yeah, the women's life and women matters are really family matters in Afghanistan, and if it gets outside the family, it's not really good. It's not considered as a good thing for the family, for the women, and women become subject to gossip, to judgments by people around them, and by other women. And these safe houses, I've been to some of the safe houses and I've spoken to women, and we actually recorded one of our debates on the situation of the safe houses and women there in one of the safe houses in Kabul. And I think they're, in my opinion, as a woman, when I met them, it was great sanctuary to women in Afghanistan, and to those women, to those horrible situations that they went through, beating up. They had their hands cut, they had their necks cut, and they had their hairs removed by the family members, and they were horrible situations. And for those women, there's no other way but to come to those safe houses. And I think, and I believe that they should carry on, be the safe houses for women who have nothing.
If I just give the context, there was a move this year by the government to try and take over some of the shelters. There's only a handful of shelters around the country, about 14 of them, and they were trying to take them over partly because of pressure from conservatives that this was inappropriate in Afghan culture to have a place where women could run away to, but also possibly some financial motivations as well.
Yeah, because running away is we have spoken to women who ran away from arranged marriages or from this kind of situation in families, and they were put in prison for that. So
a large number of people are in jail, women are in jail for having run away from home, which isn't actually a crime in the Afghan penal code, but it's that idea, I think, that you're not meant to be
running
outside
away
your
with
family.
with a non-muhram, with a man who is not known to you. That was the case of that girl in Kandahar. And it's funny because when we spoke to these women, they didn't want to go back from prison. They said, we are safe here, we don't want to go back. They wanted to, because their term was coming to an end, a year or 2 years, but they didn't want to go because they were held by these organizations. They were learning skills, they were learning education, and they were scared of how they will be dealt with in the society if they went back.
And if I could just ask you, it's still not really clear what is going to happen to the shelters, but if the government took over, were effectively the gatekeepers of these shelters, what do you fear might happen instead of NGOs, independent NGOs controlling them?
Well, in my opinion, from what I've seen and what I've heard and meeting those women, I think the more independent they are, the better it is. Government has done a lot of work for women, has brought changes, but controlling those shelters and putting it in government's hand, it might risk some of the lives of those women, and that's what I believe.
The lady in the front.
Thank you for coming to talk to us. I'm a medical doctor originally from Pakistan. What can we as women working here in the UK and going frequently to subcontinent or not, what can we do in terms of solidarity, support? Are there NGOs that you think are more worthy of support? Are there societies in the UK that we can support? You feel a bit helpless and you hear all these horrible stories.
I think there's great help available there. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I think you can do a lot of help to women of Afghanistan by just helping, I don't know, building a schoolroom for girls in a school, because many of them, they don't have school classrooms.
Particular NGOs?
There are many NGOs, especially this NGO which I have spoken to many times. They do train midwives in remote villages, and they do train the girls, young women from those villages to be, because Afghanistan has the highest rate of child mortality, and that NGO was really helping training those girls who had no education, but they were just trained in helping giving birth and to women, and those kind of NGOs do enormous work and I think people here can help those organizations in order to reach, and also the women organizations in Afghanistan. There are women NGOs in Afghan women NGOs, which is somehow related to women organizations here, but they are very independent and they work there.
There's, I would certainly vote for a couple of the women's NGOs that run some of the shelters in Afghanistan. But there's also there are groups here, umbrella groups here that work with Afghan NGOs. We can tell you a bit later.
Yeah, and I can give you contact if you. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Susan Mumford. I'm founder of the Association of Women Art Dealers. And on that note, something that I wonder is, it seems to me that it would be basically, obviously in context to this conversation, of the interest of the establishment, as it is in the culture, for the system to stay as it is. And so we're talking about NGOs helping the situation a lot, women organisations in the country being effective. Is that kind of are these the main ways that you're seeing change beginning to take place? Is it largely women driven? Is it from these international NGOs? What exactly is really beginning to make the difference? As obviously, like I said, I would think it would be of some interest to the men who are from those established traditions to keep it as it is, to never change it.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the main complaints that many Afghan people have had in the past years is that these organizations working, but the actual help doesn't go through to the real people who need it. I think maybe helping a carpet weaving family by somebody on private basis, I think that will be a great help, because these carpets are made by women and girls in the houses, and their work doesn't even get mentioned that these are made by Afghan women and girls. And there are stories of them, a mother and daughter, who are carpet weaving, and they had literally no help. The men sell the carpets that they make, and they face a lot of health. They are in risk of health problems, TB, and because of the dust of the world that they swallow every day by weaving carpets. I think on a personal basis, people can help. As charity, I don't know. What do you think?
I'll say one. I'm often the voice of gloom, but one positive thing that I see on the horizon this year is that one of the problems for I'm of the general view that supporting small Afghan NGOs is much more useful than lots of foreigners running around in flak jackets with bodyguards. But one of the problems is that they find the accounting processes, you've got huge donors, and they actually find it difficult to just give a couple of $1,000s. They actually sometimes find it easier to give $1 million sometimes to some, foreign contractor. There's a new fund that they're going to try and set up this year where lots of the big international donors can pool their resources, and that will be funneled out via a trust fund to some of the smaller Afghan NGOs, which would actually put a lot of smaller NGOs on a much more sustainable long-term footing, which would be great. So one rare bit of good news from me. I've got another question here, the lady there. Yep, you.
I want to say something regarding the help with the NGOs. If the help goes through a big NGOs, large organization, most of it goes to the corruption. So the country's going to a big corruption. That should be also considered. I think to go to help small families or small organization would be more beneficial than helping a big, which 80% goes into corruption and 20% will stay for the help. Yeah.
Do I have another question? Oh, there.
We've mentioned NGOs, we've mentioned the difficulty of accounting processes, so it feels like there's a bit of an elephant in the room, which is Greg Mortensen and the CAI. Are you able to offer any sort of comment on that situation? I think for anyone who sort of had some faith and thought it was great work, their confidence may be shaken. And I wonder if you were able to comment on any of that.
Can I just explain? Do you know, this is Greg Mortensen, who wrote 3 Cups of Tea, which has been an extraordinary international bestseller. It's about work that his charity has done setting up schools in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there was a 60 Minutes, an American show on CBS, which broadcast on Sunday, questioning the value for money from the organisation, how much was going to promote his book and how much was actually going to school buildings, and actually questioning also some of the founding stories of how this came to pass. So I'll let Zarghuna comment on that.
I think connecting with the right people is the key. Many organizations, we know that they are involved in corruption, and because the money has gone to one hand that's not been dealt with properly, and the real people are not even informed. Today we were talking in our news program about the biscuits, the energy biscuits that WFP gives away to schools and to young kids in Afghanistan. And some people said that those biscuits are actually taken by head of the school, not given to the kids who need to eat it. So it does little. I think those kind of things should be paid attention and should be observed. There should be clear observation, and it should be Afghans who are really keen to help in real meaning. They should be searched for, and there are many of them.
I think it goes back to the earlier point that that actually the more support you've got to national NGOs, the better.
Yes.
Because I don't think it takes a well-meaning white guy to have the epiphany that education is actually really important. But he's the one that gets all the attention and the media and the money, whereas there are Afghan and Pakistani NGOs that have been operating for decades trying to build and improve education that could certainly do with the support. So hopefully people will look for them now rather than the white guy in the keffiyeh. More questions from anyone? I have to confess, I also don't have a watch, so I'll just keep going until someone tells me to stop.
Hello, I'm Eleanor Morris from BBC World Service Trust. I just wanted to ask Zarghuna if there are any. We were the funding partner behind the project, and I just wanted to find out if there are any other media initiatives in Afghanistan now within local media that might be taking up some of the really good work that we did within BBC World Service Trust.
Yeah, there's a lot, and actually the training that the BBC World Service Trust provided to women who were working with me on the Afghan Woman Tewara, and the program which started, it led to many other radio and TV programs about women, for women, by local Afghan radios and TVs, and most of our reporters who are not working on the Afghan Woman Tewara, they are working with other local media, radio, TVs, and one of them was leading a local radio TV in Kandahar province. So there's a lot of the training that's been provided by the BBC and the program that was started by the BBC. It's expanded in itself because it became really popular. Only in 2 years, after 2 years, there was a survey done. And it became the most listened program, the second most listened program all over Afghanistan. And many TV and so many local radios rebroadcasted the material we were broadcasting on the BBC. And it was provided free for those local radio stations by the BBC.
So, Eleanor, can you tell us why the money was cut?
By the Foreign Office. We were funded by the Foreign Office to develop the project, and they cut the funding. This is not to do with the recent Foreign Office cuts. This goes back a year or two ago. Unfortunately.
So people should write to the Foreign Office and protest about the cutting funds.
We are very keen to develop it further, but we have to relate that back to the Foreign Office. So any notes, letters, feedback from this session would all be very useful, I think. Definitely. We'd be very
Write to your
keen
MP.
to develop it.
Write to the BBC. Sandra again.
Just a question for both of you, really. Do you think the president of Afghanistan does enough for women's rights? Because sometimes he seems to have a rather ambivalent position towards women. And why would women still be in jail just for having run away from abusive husbands, for example?
What do you think?
I think, he's got a mixed record. He's made various statements, and he has come good at various times in defence of women's rights. And I think he's a genuine believer in the need for something like women's education. But in my view, he's very dependent on a series of relationships with a bunch of former warlords and some conservative factions, and he's shown himself quite capable of trading away women's rights when it's politically expedient to do so. For instance, with the Shia personal status law, this very misogynist law that governed a series of issues for Shia women around things like custody, inheritance, marriageable age. It was a pretty draconian piece of legislation, but he signed off on it because he was bargaining for power in the run-up to the election at the time. He did a really odious deal to free some gang rapists who'd only served about less than a year, I think, of their sentence. Again, because he was friends with their family, and needed their political support at the time. So that's a pretty poor record, which is why, that's of concern when he's going to be the one leading negotiations. He's not necessarily the greatest protector of women's rights. I met him last July and asked him about talks with the Taliban and what he was prepared to sacrifice. And he said, children are dying. Am I going to keep a girl in school, or am I going to keep a child alive? And presented it as a kind of binary decision. It was either some sacrifices from women's rights, or it was continued conflict. And I think there's an alternative. I think there is a path in between where you can have some kind of reconciliation and peace without trading away all that's been gained so far. But do you want to answer that question about Karzai as well?
It's always very good to hear these kind of answers from non-Afghans who don't work.
What's the Afghan view of your president?
Putting her on the spot here.
As an Afghan woman, I think during his time, if I look at the positive sides, there are positive and negative sides. The things that you mentioned, passing the Shia law and freeing the rapist, who became very big in media, these were very upsetting for Afghan women. But on the other hand, women are talking to him in the parliament, and he is the one who is opening schools every year for girls, and he's inviting them. He is the one who is asking for peace from all sides involved. For me, and I think many people about their own presidents will have certain opinions, and he's just a president for me. And I'm not living there to comment on it, like really as an Afghan woman who has lived there and who has been through that time that she wasn't allowed to go to school because I wasn't in Kabul that time, or I wasn't in Afghanistan. But politically it's very difficult for me to answer. Thank you.
I'm being told we're running out of time, so I think I'm going to take one more question. Is that right? Yes? Okay, the gentleman there in the middle.
Hi, I'll ask if your understanding this is a little bit naive or ill-informed, but we've talked a little bit about the huge kind of international aid, capital inflows into Afghanistan and the problems with corruption there. I was wondering if there had been much of a role for microfinance, or whether you thought there would be much of a role for microfinance in terms of encouraging women's rights.
There has been there has been many NGOs who do microfinance work with the women who do sewing, who do embroideries, and who make jewelries, and these are women, widow women, who have been paid by private organization or NGOs. And they have been paid money, and now we have spoken to many of them on the program. There are examples of this, but to women who really need it in remote villages, it's not so accessible. It's limited. And I think there's much more chance to get it to those women who need it and who are suffering.
But there are some great stories. There are several organisations who are quite engaged in microfinance and have some really positive results. There was a terrible tragedy just a few months ago, actually, of a leading woman in Helmand, where it's a difficult place to start. It's one of the most conservative areas, one of the most conflict-ridden in the south. And she was running a project trying to encourage other women to do microfinance projects. That was what her NGO did, and she and a colleague of hers had come under lots of threats to stop being in public, to stop encouraging other women to be working, and she was assassinated, and her colleague in I think October last year. So it's happening, but it can be dangerous work, depending on where in the country. It's much easier to do a lot of this development work in the non-conflict areas, which unfortunately leads to sort of resentment and imbalance. That the north, you'll get massive progress in parts of the north or the west that you don't see in some of the more conflict-ridden areas. But it's certainly some great stories in other parts of the country.
Of course, there are organizations who do candle making. I've met many women who make cakes for the market, and they are all microfinance projects, but they are more in the cities where there's relatively secure and security is there, so they can do it.
Well, we'll leave it there, but I will encourage you to come and buy Zarghuna's book and get it signed. And I wish you luck with it. I hope it's a great success, and I'm really glad that you've brought this to the world, these stories to the world. I think you've done a great service to Afghan women in doing so. So
thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and good luck with it.
Thanks.